Hola, muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Bienvenidas a este tercer Congreso de Periodismo de Migraciones de Mérida. Perdonad el retraso, pequeñas dificultades técnicas, pero ya estamos aquí con vosotras. Antes de empezar esta sesión, os voy a pedir, por favor, que mantengáis vuestro vídeo y vuestro audio apagado para que todo sea más fluido. También, por favor, os voy a pedir que participéis en una pequeña encuesta que vamos a lanzar al principio para que la sesión sea lo más dinámica posible. Y bueno, pues sin más, voy a presentaros a los tres ponentes que tenemos hoy con nosotros. Por un lado tenemos a Blanca Tapia, directora de programas de la Agencia de Derechos Fundamentales de la Unión Europea. Por otro, Robert Holloway, veterano corresponsal y editor jefe adjunto de AFP. Y AIDA KAISY, periodista y miembro de la Ethical Journalism Network. Muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, welcome, and the space is yours.
Thank you very much. We'll start right away as we don't want to, we know that at exactly 7 o'clock we'll be cut off. So let's go for it. So I think as you can see right now, I asked them to launch a poll because it's always very important to know where you following us from. So this is Blanca and I'm following you. I'm connecting from Vienna. Robert?
Hello.
You are in
Paris.
In Paris. And Aida?
I'm in London.
Okay, fantastic. So it would be fantastic to know where you're following us from. And also, we would be very much appreciating if you can give us some information about or some expectations for this next minute so we make the best out of it so you can really enjoy it. And then, yes, and then there was a last question there about migration and inclusion that I don't know why, but anyway, it could be quite interesting. I was expecting another one. But nevertheless, what we're going to talk really about is what makes a human, what is a human story and what is the humanity in the stories of migration. So just to go a little bit back here, in 2015 and 2016, in Europe, where we lived was a political crisis on how to deal with migration. Of course, the politicians in the EU, where I work, are quite smart, and we call it the migrant crisis, because it's much easier to put the focus on the migrants instead of on the failures of in general, all the institutions that were supposed and were alerted that this was coming and didn't know how to react. And we saw these awful images and awful stories of people, awful from the point of view of the pain and suffering that they were going through that actually shouldn't have happened. Of course, the media did their part and they took two angles of it at the very beginning when a news story breaks, which is they reported about the number of people arriving and they reported on the human stories. So on what was going on that suffering, on those images that really hooks the audience. When the audience feels that story, they get connected. But there is a lot more than that. And Robert has actually worked for so many years and is such a veteran. And he was there in New York during 9/11. And he happened to be there as well during Nice. And the problem I see after all these years is that there were many questions that were left unanswered. So out of the 5 W's, what was left unanswered was the why. Why are these people arriving? And why are we in this situation? And why there is no solution to this? So I was wondering, Robert, if with your years of experience, if you can tell us if why, and also the why of the situation is never something that comes into the news agenda.
Well, I think that the question why is always along with how. You know, the question why is really the most difficult question of the traditional 5 W's for a journalist to answer. I think before getting into that, I think it would be useful if we remind ourselves that migration is an extremely old and very common phenomenon. I live in France, and about 10% of the population of France are migrants. It's migrants. Sometimes the press talks about, the media talk about migrants as if they were a separate category of people different from the rest of humanity. But that's not the case. Everybody has a right to leave their country and seek life elsewhere, and it's quite a common phenomenon. I am a migrant. I grew up in the UK, but I have spent all my adult life in France, and I've become a citizen of this country. But to get back to your question, I think we have to remember that. But to get back to your question about the why, there are many, many reasons why people leave their countries, why they migrate. At the time of the crisis you're talking about, the political crisis in 2015-16, that wave of migration was prompted partly by the civil war in Syria and the turmoil in the Middle East, and partly by economic conditions in Africa. But that's not that is not the only reason why people move. You get the impression that these people were fleeing conflict, were fleeing persecution. But in fact, if you look at the figures for France, about a third of the migrants who were given right to residence in France last year had come to join their families, and about another third had come to study. So I think that the question why is a very complicated one, and the only way to answer it successfully is to interview people and give them a voice. Of all the recommendations in the toolkit which we put together, giving migrants a voice is probably the most difficult one to achieve. There are many reasons why people might be reluctant to talk. They might be reluctant to talk because they don't speak the language well in the country they arrive in, because the journalist is not equipped to ask them. They may have come from a country where they have very good reasons for wanting to keep quiet, and so on. That's just a beginning, if you like. It's not a complete answer, but I think that's given a start to an answer to your question.
Thank you. And I think there was also another thing that for me was important in this toolkit we worked together on, that is based on the dilemmas in the newsrooms, in many newsrooms, but actually in both sides of the British Channel, in England and in France, on reporting on this. And we used actually, and we followed a template that is based on the 5 guidelines, ethical guidelines on migration reporting. And AIDA works in the Ethical Journalism Network, who has done this migration reporting. And I'm going to share with the audience the guidelines in Spanish, but I would like you to tell us about those 5 key principles of migration reporting. And in particular, maybe you could focus on the principle of humanity.
Yeah, so we did some work speaking to journalists in different contexts around the world to try and really understand where they were facing challenges when covering migration reporting. And also we asked them to analyze some of the content they were seeing within the context of their countries, again, to understand what was missing. So where journalists were struggling on migration reporting and what was missing in content. And we came up with the 5-point test, which draws on our 5 core principles of ethical journalism. So, know the facts, not bias. And that's really important, actually, particularly when we're talking about migration, because we're often talking about numbers, and we're often talking about numbers that aren't necessarily 100% verified. So it's very clear. That's a very clear point, guideline. We also, one of the things that really came across was this lack of knowledge of the law and legislation and legislative processes that allow or disallow migrants to move from country to country. So again, that was another sort of key point. And all of these points, I think, really are important when we start to think about covering stories in a humane way, where we consider humanity. The principle of humanity in these guidelines is very much focused around this idea, again, of avoiding using the language of hate. One of the things that you see in migration coverage is often journalists taking the path of using the language of institutions, politicians, the public to describe what's going on, and creating this kind of negative representation of migration. And what the 5-point test really sort of presses journalists to do is give the full context, to really tell the full story, tell the full picture, basically, of what's actually going on. One of the key things that we talk about in the migration guidelines is also, again, it's back to this idea of telling the story of migrants, giving voices to diverse representation of migrants. So migrants are women, they're mothers, they're different ethnic minorities, they're children. So it's thinking about representing people as humans, as individual human beings, and not just this wave or swarm or numbers of people crossing the channels or crossing various borders. There are a number of questions that you might be able to ask yourself as a journalist when you're covering migration stories after you've written the piece, maybe before it goes to publication. Think about giving the full picture, telling the full picture. Think about the fact that some of your audience are also migrants. So not only are you telling the story of migrants, you might also be speaking to migrants as well. So that's also quite important. Think about the circumstances in the country, in people's countries that are driving them to make these very difficult and challenging journeys. What is it actually like to live in Afghanistan or Iraq or Ethiopia? When people are making these journeys and they arrive in camps, what are the conditions like in camps? Tell these stories. We need to hear what's happening. We need to hear the full picture. And then also, it's really important as well to talk about the context of the countries that migrants are arriving in. What are the problems that our own societies have that might be affected by migration? What skills are migrants bringing to our society? How are they contributing? So all of these things, all of these questions, I think, are worth bearing in mind and considering when you're sort of writing a piece and you're trying to cover a story ethically. I'll just add that obviously one of the areas that is really important to consider is photojournalism as well when we talk about migration, because some of the sort of bigger stories, if you like, or stories that might have been seen to shape policy or shift policy have borne out of stories and images. So the young Kurdish boy who was washed up on the shores in Europe, Aylan Kurdi, was a really impactful image that really raised the profile of the crisis, I think, amongst much of the European and global public. And then I think last year as well, another really important story was the story of Oscar Martinez and his young daughter Valeria. And both of those stories were quite interesting because you might ask yourself as a photojournalist, is this photo worth replicating? What am I is this image? There was a lot of criticism around the use of the image of Aylan Kurdi, for example, by people suggesting that if the body had been a European or a white boy, the image might have been less likely to have been used and circulated, and that there was almost a sort of disengagement with the fact that it was a young child of Kurdish origin. In the case of Oscar Martinez and Valeria, the image again circulated widely across social media. But actually what's interesting is at the time of that image circulating, the Democrats in the House were actually moving towards approval of an emergency $4.5 billion humanitarian aid bill to address the problems of migrants at the border. So, it's thinking about the context, thinking about the wider implications of what you're publishing, be it an image or be it words, and how that might impact on migrants, migration, and the society at large.
Thank you, Aida. I would love to, I'm looking at the chat. If somebody would be willing to or has a question, please go ahead and start asking those questions, because I think it's quite interesting to hear your questions. And we're here, and you only have 10 minutes left. So go ahead and ask the questions via the chat. I will be very glad to put them to Robert and to Aida here. I also want to take an opportunity here. Look, when we talk about migration, we really want to give voice to the migrants so they tell their own story. But have we forgotten about the people? So I was thinking about the community who who is looking into this. I was thinking about our director from the Fundamental Rights Agency was just last week in Moria in Greece, and he visited it and he talked to the migrants. But I was thinking, why don't you visit also the locals? Why don't you ask them as well? Because people, there is a point of time that maybe the audience has said, okay, I know already these images, but I want to know how people in the area have been impacted by migration and maybe how they have changed the way they react to migrants. And that could be a story that could also be interesting. I don't know. It's never in the news. Why? Robert? Aida?
Well, I don't think it's never in the news. I mean, some of the case studies which we chose for the toolkit we worked on, there was one from the Financial Times, did a very, very big report about a town in the north of Holland, in the north of the Netherlands, which was a place which was had a reputation for being the most right-wing, anti-immigrant town in the country. And this, the reporter, who was a part Dutch, part British, who went there and who spoke to people for 3 days, and he discovered that there was a very, very wide range of quite complex reactions to, and it wasn't at all the kind of stereotypical anti-immigrant feeling which the populist politicians would like us have us believe. And there was another case. Remember that the migration, the big flow of migration into Europe in 2016 was only a year before the presidential election in France. It was politically very significant in France. And Radio France Internationale did a superb piece of reporting where they went and interviewed people in the villages on the Italian-French border. And a part of the country which I went to last year, and I discovered that the people's reaction to migration is far more subtle and far more complex than you might think. I mean, this is a region where up until about 60 years ago, some of those villages were Italian, not French, and now they're French today. So people are very sensitive to the question of changing identities and changing nationalities. So I don't think it's true that those questions are never asked, but I agree that they're not in the front of the kind of reporting that's done.
Exactly, they don't make it to mainstream news, and they're very important because, as you say, then the rest of the people, believe in the story from the right wing that is telling us all this repetition that migrants are not being welcome, or that people fear them, or that they don't want this diversity in their communities. And maybe, as you said, this is a lot more subtle. So what do you think, Aida? And then we wrap up now before we're kicked out.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you and with Robert. Actually, I do. I think there are some great positive stories to tell, and they need to be told. But we do have to remember that journalism is under pressure, financial pressure, with weak economies, funding for journalism, investigative pieces. It all needs to be justified, basically, and I think that's a huge issue that a lot of journalists face. We also need to remember that, unfortunately, we live in countries more and more, even in the Western world, where the media is driven by political bias and the news agendas and opportunism that comes from politicians. And so, again, it's very difficult sometimes for the individual journalists to navigate some of these issues when they're working on migration stories. So I think within all of that, we just need to, when we are reporting on events and the news, we need to be considering this. So rather than doing these sort of extra pieces and what have you, it is about diverse voices. It is about ensuring that you have diverse sources within your reporting. So when you're telling the story from a political perspective, you're including the voice of the migrant, you're including the voices of locals, you're considering how social media is reacting around these events and taking all of that into consideration. And then I think you tend to then tell a sort of fuller picture and fulfill your role as a sort of independent, impartial and ethical journalist, because humanity is at play.
Exactly. Let me see if we have more questions there, or are we now being kicked out?
I'm so sorry, but we have to finish here. Thank you so much, Blanca, Robert, and Aida, for your time. Thank you to the audience as well for being listening. And we will see you in another occasion to keep up with this important discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And just before we go, just to say that tomorrow I'll be doing an online workshop on the e-media toolkit. Y este taller va a estar en español, así que estaría encantada de teneros ahí, y empezará a las 5 de la tarde y luego lo repetiría a las 5:30.
Exacto, os esperamos a todas ahí. Muchísimas gracias, Blanca. Gracias. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.